All right, let's kick off this deep dive with a look at some pretty potent commentary from Senator Bernie Sanders on, the recent struggles of the Democratic Party in elections. Yeah, definitely some interesting stuff to unpack there.
Okay, so right away, Sanders just lays it out there.
Yeah.
He says the Democratic Party has basically lost touch with the needs and realities of the working class, and that this disconnect is driving disillusionment.
Right. People are feeling let down.
And, they're starting to look for other options. He's got this one quote that really hits hard. He says, "It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that working class people have abandoned them."
Powerful stuff, for sure. It's like a mirror being held up.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And he makes it clear this isn't just about white working class voters. Black and Latino workers are feeling this disconnect too.
Yeah, he's emphasizing that this is a broader trend than a lot of people might realize. And this is where things get even more interesting. Sanders digs into the Democratic Party's messaging, right? He argues that they've become too focused on, talking about policy achievements.
Like they're checking boxes.
Yeah, without really acknowledging the economic pain that so many Americans are actually going through.
So it's like they're listing accomplishments but not connecting with people's lived experience.
Exactly. It's a disconnect. He contrasts this with, FDR's approach during the Depression. FDR acknowledged the suffering, even while highlighting progress.
Right, so it's about striking that balance,
Mhm.
acknowledging reality but also offering hope.
Exactly. And Sanders points out some key issues he feels were kind of ignored in recent campaigns, like income inequality
Yeah, that's a huge one.
and lack of universal health care, and of course, the struggles of those earning less than $15 an hour.
So he's saying these are the bread and butter issues that really hit home for people.
And it makes you wonder, do you think he's right? Did the Democratic Party's messaging miss the mark in terms of connecting with those real struggles?
That's a great question for our listeners to consider, for sure.
Now, Sanders also dives into this whole idea of identity politics, as he calls it. And he's very clear that he's all for fighting for equality.
Right, like ending bigotry and discrimination.
Exactly. But he argues that this focus shouldn't overshadow addressing economic issues that are just so central to working class struggles, regardless of identity.
So it's about finding that balance again, right?
Right. He sees this potential for alienation, among working class voters who maybe feel like they're being excluded or even reprimanded.
Like you're being talked down to.
Yeah, because of certain language or approaches in these conversations.
It's a sensitive area, for sure.
So the challenge, as he sees it, is for the party to champion both economic justice and social justice without alienating potential voters.
It's a tightrope walk, no question. And it raises another big question for our listeners. Can the Democratic Party actually achieve that balance?
And then there's Sanders' take on media engagement, or maybe the lack thereof. He's pretty critical of the Democratic Party's, reluctance to engage with more diverse media outlets and audiences.
He doesn't hold back on that point.
He uses his own appearance on Joe Rogan's show as an example.
Yeah.
Contrasting it with the hesitancy of other Democratic figures to do the same.
Right, to step outside of that comfort zone.
So he's basically saying avoiding these platforms just because of potential disagreement or discomfort is a losing strategy.
It's about meeting people where they are.
Yeah, and I get that. But, I also wonder if there's a risk of legitimizing platforms that could be spreading misinformation or harmful ideologies.
That's a really good point. It's a tough call, right? Like, how do you balance reaching a wide audience with potentially giving a platform to harmful views?
It's a complex media landscape we're in. There's no easy answer.
For sure. It's something we all have to think about as we engage with these different media platforms.
Yeah, definitely requires some thought. Okay, moving on. Sanders basically challenges the Democratic Party's core vision.
Like their fundamental approach.
He believes they need to be way more forceful in tackling corporate greed and the influence of big money in politics.
He's been saying this for years, right? That the system is rigged against working people.
And it ties into that contrast he draws with figures like Elon Musk, who really emphasize private sector solutions.
Like the idea that innovation and technology will solve everything.
Sanders is pushing for a more robust and efficient government role in making people's lives better.
So it's not just about letting the market run its course. It's about the government stepping in and ensuring a fairer playing field.
Exactly. He's calling for a real rethink of the balance between the private sector and government in addressing these big societal issues.
Which is especially relevant given how quickly technology is advancing. I mean, technology has the power to do so much good, but only if it's harnessed for the benefit of everyone, not just a select few.
That's a key point. It's not enough to just celebrate technological progress. We have to make sure its benefits are shared equitably.
Couldn't agree more. We can't just assume technology will automatically lead to a better society.
Yeah.
We need to be intentional about how we develop and use it to ensure it serves the common good.
Well said. So I'm curious, what are your initial takeaways from Sanders' critique? Is it resonating with you? Do you think it offers a compelling analysis of the challenges facing the Democratic Party?
I think he raises some really important points, especially about the need to reconnect with the working class and be more courageous in tackling economic inequality. But I also think, we need to be realistic about the complexities of the political landscape and the potential challenges with some of his proposed solutions. It's a conversation that needs careful thought and nuance.
Yeah, definitely a lot to consider.
For sure. Going back to this idea of technology and its impact, Sanders seems to be saying that while it has the potential to make our lives better, it's not automatically a force for good.
It's like a tool,
Right.
right? It depends on how it's used.
Exactly. He seems to be suggesting that we need to be careful about who controls technology and who ultimately benefits from it.
Because if it's just concentrated in the hands of a few,
Right. Then it could actually worsen inequality rather than reduce it.
and Sanders also points out that there's this broader issue of a loss of faith in government itself.
Yeah, like a growing sense of cynicism that the government can't really solve problems effectively.
Even when the government does take positive steps, there's so much bureaucracy and, slow implementation.
It can take forever for things to actually change.
So it's hard for people to see the impact in their own lives,
Yeah.
which just fuels that cynicism.
Like, why bother? Nothing ever really changes.
And that, of course, plays right into the hands of those who want to shrink the government and push for more private sector solutions.
Right, because if you don't believe the government can do anything right,
Then why would you want them to have more power or resources?
so it's this vicious cycle, and it's tough to break out of it. And that brings us back to that contrast Sanders draws with people like Elon Musk, who really believe that the private sector can innovate and solve problems way better than the government ever could.
Yeah, they see the government as slow, inefficient, bureaucratic.
And they see the private sector as nimble, innovative, driven by results.
But Sanders pushes back on that, right? He points out that private sector solutions often just end up making inequality worse
Like, sure, they might create a lot of wealth,
for a small number of people at the top.
but that doesn't necessarily translate into better lives for most working-class Americans.
So he's advocating for a more balanced approach, one that recognizes the potential of both the private sector and, a strong and effective government
working together.
to create a more equitable society. But how do we bridge that gap? How do we restore faith in government and convince people that it can actually be a force for good? It feels like such a huge challenge.
Well, Sanders offers some ideas. He talks about attracting younger people into public service, people who are really driven by a sense of mission.
Like they actually want to make a difference?
Exactly. And he also emphasizes improving working conditions within government, making sure public servants are paid fairly, feel valued.
So that you attract and retain talented people who want to dedicate their careers to public service.
He uses teachers as an example, pointing out how undervalued and underpaid they are despite playing such a critical role in our society.
Which really speaks to this broader issue of how we value certain professions, right? We say education is important.
But then we don't back that up with the resources and the respect that teachers deserve.
It's a disconnect. And of course, Sanders reiterates his support for policies like universal health care, expanding Social Security.
Those are his signature issues.
He sees those as essential steps towards creating a society where everyone has a decent standard of living, where basic needs are met. But I mean, those policies face some pretty big obstacles, right?
Yeah.
Political obstacles, logistical challenges.
Not to mention the costs.
So is he being a little too idealistic in his vision?
It's a fair question. And to be honest, it's not just about enacting specific policies. Sanders acknowledges this deep voter disillusionment that exists. People have lost faith in the system itself. It's not just about disagreeing with this policy or that policy.
It's about feeling like the whole system is rigged against them.
Like their voices don't matter, that the government doesn't care about them.
And that's a much deeper problem than just policy disagreements. And he makes this pretty stark observation about how, even within the Democratic caucus, there's this feeling that they, meaning the American people, have come to hate both the party and the government in general. Wow. That's a pretty bleak assessment.
It certainly doesn't paint a very rosy picture.
And it highlights just how big of a challenge Democrats are facing. trying to rebuild that trust, convince voters that the government can actually work for them.
It's a huge undertaking, and it's made even harder by the rise of figures like Trump, who exploit that cynicism, offer these simple, often divisive solutions.
That really resonate with people who feel left behind by the system.
Sanders acknowledges that Trump did offer a vision, even though he sees it as a dishonest and harmful one.
But he seems to be saying that Democrats need to develop their own compelling counter-narrative, a vision of a just and equitable society that can actually inspire people.
And give them hope for the future.
It can't just be about criticizing the other side. It has to be about offering a real alternative, a path forward that addresses those very real struggles that people are facing.
And provides a sense of possibility.
Yeah, like things can actually get better, but can they actually deliver on that vision?
That's the question, right? Can they overcome the gridlock, the special interests, the cynicism that seems to have infected our politics?
Sanders believes they can, but he's very clear that it's going to require a pretty fundamental shift in the Democratic Party's approach.
A willingness to shake things up, to challenge the status quo.
And to fight for the needs of working-class Americans in a way that maybe they haven't in a long time.
He's given us a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Definitely. So much to unpack here.
It really does feel like we're at this kind of turning point, you know, where there's all this disillusionment with the government and the whole political process.
But at the same time, we have all these really big problems that need us to work together to solve them.
Exactly. And Sanders is arguing that the Democratic Party has to step up and be the one to lead that charge.
But he's also saying they need a serious change in how they do things.
Like, he thinks they've gotten too cautious, too focused on making these tiny changes instead of going for bolder solutions.
And he pushes back on this idea that the progressive policies he's always talking about are unpopular.
Right, like, people actually want this stuff.
He brings up the example of Missouri, which is usually considered a pretty conservative state. And the voters there, they overwhelmingly supported raising the minimum wage.
Huh, interesting.
But at the same time, they also voted for Trump.
So it's like, what's going on there?
It shows how complicated things are. People might say they want one thing in polls.
But then they vote a totally different way.
Sanders seems to think Democrats need to figure out how to connect those dots better.
Like, show people how these progressive policies can actually make their lives better.
And this is where his point about communication is so important. It's not enough just to have good ideas.
You have to be able to connect with people on an emotional level.
Make them feel like you understand their struggles, their hopes.
It's about storytelling, really.
And it's interesting because he's pretty much ruled out running for president himself again.
Yeah, he seems to be saying he's done with that.
But he does lay out what he thinks the ideal candidate would be like. Someone who can connect with working-class voters.
Someone who's not afraid to take on big corporations and the whole influence of money in politics.
Someone with a bold vision for the future.
So after all this, after this deep dive into Sanders' perspective, what do we think? Is he giving us a realistic path forward for the Democratic Party?
Can they actually win back trust and start winning elections again?
Or has the political landscape changed so much that his ideas just won't work anymore?
That's the big question we'll leave you with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some things to think about as you navigate this crazy world.